Canning is an excellent way to preserve foods. Through the use of high temperature, dangerous microorganisms are killed and the food is safely preserved. During the heating process, excess oxygen is forced out of the jar and a vacuum is formed. The jar is sealed with this vacuum in place so that no additional microorganisms can enter. I'm going to refer to this process as canning. In some parts of Alaska, it is called jarring. I will be walking you through the use of a pressure canner in this process. I'm Julie Cassio with the Cooperative Extension Service of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Highly acidic foods may be preserved using a water bath canner, but low-acid foods such as meat, fish, game meat, and vegetables must be canned in a pressure canner to be safe. Microbiological contaminants that live in the high-acid environment are relatively easy to kill by applying heat. The temperature required to can acidic foods is 212 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the boiling point of water at sea level. Contaminants that live in the low-acid environment must be killed with a higher level of heat. So how do you know whether the product you want to preserve requires pressure canning? Whether food should be preserved in a pressure canner or a boiling water canner depends on the acidity of the product. Acidity may be natural, as in most fruits, or acid, or with added acid, as in pickled foods. The microorganisms that grow in an acid environment are easy to kill at boiling water temperatures. Those products that are less acid have microorganisms that require a higher temperature, and these temperatures can only be reached by using a pressure canner. Low-acid foods have pH values higher than 4.6. These include red meats, seafood, poultry, game meats, and vegetables. If you are canning any of these products, use the pressure canner. You should have a manual or product guide for your canner. Always follow the instructions specific to your make and model. If you don't have the product guide, you can order a new one from the manufacturer. For specific canning instructions, use materials from the United States Department of Agriculture. There are two types of pressure canners. We have the weighted gauge and the dial gauge. Which should you use? That depends. Whether you would prefer to watch the correct pressure level or listen for it. The weighted gauge can be adjusted to pressures of 5, 10, and 15 pounds. Another type of weighted gauge actually has 3 different pieces. There's the stem piece, which if you put that on your pressure canner is 5 pounds. Add another layer, and then it's 10 pounds of pressure. And when you add the third layer, it gives you 15 pounds of pressure. When the canner reaches the correct pressure, depending upon which kind of weight you have, it will either rock or jiggle at that pressure. The dial gauge canner has a dial on top of the lid that allows you to see the pressure and monitor changes that are going on inside the canner visually. Aside from this basic difference, both canners work in a similar manner. Canners are usually of aluminum construction with clamps or turn lids that lock into place for safety. Parts of a dial gauge canner include the lid, which is this part, a gasket, or some have the metal-to-metal seal. You need a rack to keep the jars from touching the bottom of the canner, the dial gauge, the vent pipe, and a dead weight. This is one style of dead weight. Another style looks just like the weights that you use on the weighted gauge canner, but it's used as a dead weight. Or it could be closed with a petcock. There's also a vent lock piston, an overpressure plug. Parts of a weighted gauge canner, again, include the lid, a gasket, a rack to keep the jars from touching the bottom of the canner. This time, though, you have a weighted gauge. The weighted gauge has the levels marked, 10 pounds, 15 pounds, and 5 pounds. You would just turn it with this type of weighted gauge to change the level of the pressure, or you might use the weighted gauge that has the different pieces. This would be a 15-pound pressure. The vent pipe, again, in this instance, the vent pipe is closed with the weighted gauge. There is also a lock, and the lock inside of the cover is inside of the cover, so you don't see it on the outside, and an overpressure plug. Once you understand how the canner works, it's time to think about your heat source. Most of us can on a regular gas or electric stove, although it is possible to can on a wood stove or even a camp stove. The important thing is that the stove produces enough heat to bring the canner up to pressure and keep it there. Consistency of heat is the key. If you are using a non-traditional heat source, such as the camp stove, do a dry run to ensure that it will come to pressure before you risk the food that you plan to can. Make sure you have adequate fuel for the long processing times without any breaks. Either an electric or gas range will can your food products safely. Keep in mind, though, that a gas range will respond more quickly to adjustments made in the heat. An electric range responds more slowly. Extra care should be taken when canning on a smooth top range. First, check the manufacturer's instructions for your range top. Once you fill the canner with water in jars, the canner becomes quite heavy and may cause the smooth top range to fail. Again, double check your range instructions for the manufacturer's recommendations. Second, check the bottom of your canner. Some canners have a flat bottom all the way across. When placed on the smooth top range, heat builds up around the pan, which may result in breakage of the smooth top. Other canners have a flat disc that's raised about 1/4 of an inch on the bottom of in the center of the bottom. This allows a bit of airflow and keeps the heat from building up around the outside edges of the canner. These canners are the ones that are recommended if you are canning on a smooth top range. Your heat source needs to be large enough and stable enough to support canning for an extended length of time. It should be free from drafts, because a draft can quickly affect the canning pressure. If you plan to can outdoors, say the lake or the riverbank where you're catching fish, make sure that your stove is protected from drafts and that it has enough heat to work correctly. Let's go through the steps of pressure canning. To begin the canning process, center your canner on your heat source and add water. If you're using raw pack or cold pack, then you want to start with cool water. If you are using hot pack foods, where the jars are hot, the food inside of it is hot, then you want to start with hot water. And you do this to avoid heat stress on your jars. You want 3 inches of water in the bottom of your canner. And since it's hard to see just by looking inside, using a ruler helps you judge how much water is in the bottom of that canner. Then you need to take your rack and put it into the canner. This is to avoid the jars touching the bottom of the canner, which gets very hot during the canning process. You're going to use a jar lifter. Well, it's easiest if you use a jar lifter. Of course, if the product is cold, you can use your fingers, but when you're doing a hot pack, the jar lifter really protects your hands from that process. We're using a 16-pint canner. That means that I can put 8 pints on the bottom of this canner, and then a rack, and then layer it with another 8 pints of jars on the second layer. If you don't have a rack, what you can do is stagger your jars inside the canner or offset them so they're not directly on top of each other. If you are using a second layer, then as soon as you get your jars inside, you add the next rack and then the next layer on top of that. Check your manufacturer's directions to see how many jars your canner will hold. When you get the jars into the canner and you get it filled, When you put the lid on, and to do this you match your arrows. There's an arrow on the lid and there's an arrow on your canner. You match those up and then you turn your lid so that it locks in place. When we're using the canner type that uses the clamps, we want to bring the clamps up on opposite sides and just barely get them so that they are fitted in on top. And after you get all of them around, then you can begin tightening them, and you do it with opposite clamps so that your lid is on evenly and you don't have steam escaping. If you're using the canner that has a turn-on lid, again you match your arrows, and usually the arrows are by the handles, and you turn it on so that it locks securely. Once you have your jars filled in the canner lid is on, you want to make sure that your vent port is open, and now you're going to turn on your heat to high. And you leave that on high heat until the canner comes up to pressure and begins emitting steam through this vent port. And that steam, when it becomes a steady stream, you let it go for 10 minutes. At the end of 10 minutes, then you're going to put your dead weight on. If you are using a dial gauge canner, if you're using a weighted gauge canner, then you would put it on the weight that you need. Since we're using a dial gauge canner right now, we're going to put our dead weight on and let it get set. Let the heat begin to rise inside the canner. And you can tell this on the dial gauge by watching the needle. And it will take a little bit for this to come up to pressure. If you are using a weighted gauge canner, then you want to listen for, you've put the dead weight on top of the vent port after the steam has come out, and we're using 10 pounds on this particular canner, weighted gauge canner, and when it starts jiggling, then it will be up to the 10 pounds pressure. And that's what we're listening for. Why is pressure important in canning? The temperature of boiling water cannot exceed 212 degrees Fahrenheit unless it's under pressure. The higher the pressure, the higher the temperature that's inside the canner. A temperature of 242 degrees Fahrenheit, which is reached at 10 to 11 pounds pressure, is required to kill some of the microorganisms. You need to start timing the process when the pressure reading on your dial gauge indicates that the recommended pressure has been reached, or when the weighted gauge begins to jiggle or rock, not before that. Regulate the heat source to maintain a steady pressure at or slightly above the correct gauge pressure. If the pressure drops below the recommendation, then the canner must be brought back up to the recommended level and the timing started over again. Quick and large pressure variations during processing may cause unnecessary liquid loss from jars. Review the manufacturer's instructions for weighted gauge canners to ensure that your weighted gauge is properly adjusted. It's a really good idea to do a dry run before you begin to actually process food. And why do you want to do a dry run? You want to check to ensure that your canner is working correctly and that you are comfortable with the process of how the canner works, as well as knowing how your heat source works with your canner. When the time process is completed, turn off your heat and remove the canner from the heat source to cool down. Let it cool all the way so that it completely depressurizes inside. But allow that pressure to drop naturally. Don't apply cold cloths or put it in cold water or take it out into the cold air. Heavy-walled canners require about 30 minutes if they're filled with pint jars and 45 minutes if they're filled with quart jars to cool down. Thin-walled canners will cool a little bit more rapidly. When the pressure on the dial gauge drops all the way to 0, then you can remove the weight from your vent port. You can actually check it to make sure that it's completely down. If there's no hissing noise when you tip it, then it's a good chance that the air is completely out. The pressure is completely out. If you are using a weighted gauge canner, of course the vent port is where your weighted gauge is. So again, to test that, to make sure that the weight is out, or the pressure is completely out because you don't have the dial gauge that gives you a clue, you just tip it with your fingernail, or of course it's going to be hot, use the end of your hot pad to tip it and make sure that there's no hissing sound inside the canner. When it has come completely down, again, you want to wait about 10 minutes before you unfasten your lid, and this is to make sure that there's nothing stuck inside the vent port that might cause problems. So it's been 10 minutes. Now we can unfasten our lid. It's still very hot inside this canner. So when we take our lid off, we're going to tip it. We have to turn it so it's not locked, and we're going to tip it away from us so the steam does not burn our faces. Remove jars with the lifter. Place them on a towel or cooling rack to allow them to cool. You need something to put the jars on because they're very hot and you want to protect your counter surface. Allow the jars to cool for 12 hours before moving them again so that you don't compromise your seal. Jars should be cooled in an area away from drafts because the air blowing on the hot jars can cause thermal breakage. And never rush your cooling process or your jars may break. When the canning process is complete and your jars have cooled for 12 hours, then it's time to check your seals. One way to do that is looking to see that the jar lid has pulled down and it's concave. Another way is to just press on it and see if there's any give in the lid of the jar. Another way is to take the back of the spoon and just kind of tap it to see if something sounds different. That jar did not seal. If you have a jar that does not seal, you have a couple of choices. Within 24 hours from the time that you finished processing it, then you can reprocess the jar. You just need to put a new lid on it before you process it. Also check the edge of your jar to make sure that there's no nicks, which would prevent a seal from forming at all. If you don't want to reprocess it, you can adjust the head space so that it's 1.5 inches and put it in the freezer. Or you can take this jar and store it in the refrigerator for 3 to 4 days. Of course, you have to use it within that time period. Rings may be removed from the jars before storing, and in fact, we do recommend that you remove the jars so that you don't get rust accumulation on the inside of the ring, which can compromise the seal, and all your hard work is for naught. Then you want to store your jars in a cool, dry place. You need to make sure that they're labeled. On the label you need to put what it is, because after it sits up in the cupboard and with all the other things that you've canned, and you don't remember what it is, then you're going to wish that you had labeled it. So you need to label with what it is, any special things you did for the recipe, if you put salt in or didn't put salt in, you might want to mark that. You also need to put the date that it was processed and how you processed it. For example, with the fish, I processed it for 100 minutes at 11 pounds pressure because I used a dial gauge canner. So these things are all very important and need to be represented on the lid of your jar. For best quality, use home canned foods within 1 year. Pressure canning is a safe process if it is done correctly. Because canning requires the use of high temperatures and pressure, canners are designed with safety in mind. The lid of your canner locks on. If any pressure remains in the canner, the lock will keep you from opening the lid. Since there's no pressure inside this canner, we can open it. There's also an overpressure plug, which is a rubber gasket that blows out if the pressure gets too high inside the canner. This releases pressure to prevent a more serious accident from happening. To keep your canner in good repair, perform standard maintenance. The dial gauge should be checked once a year for accuracy. Take this to the local Cooperative Extension Service office or mail it to your manufacturer to be checked. Before canning, look through the vent pipe to make sure that it's unobstructed. Hold the lid up to the light to make sure that you can see light through that vent pipe opening. If you're not sure whether the vent pipe is clear, run a wire or a pipe cleaner through it. Take these additional steps to ensure safety when canning. Avoid subjecting glass jars to sudden temperature changes, and always use a rack in the bottom of your canner. This prevents the jars from touching the hot bottom of the canner. Use a jar lifter to remove the filled jars from the canner and to put the jars into the canner. And when opening a canner, always open the lid away from you. Don't try to peek inside. That steam is very hot. Follow these general instructions to use your pressure canner safely.